welcome to the American Almanac podcast, the podcast where we explore significant moments in our nation's history, one day at a time. I'm your host, Jim Hunt. Today, we delve deep into an event that forever altered the course of America: the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865. Picture the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. on that Good Friday in 1865. The Civil War, which had torn the nation apart for 4 grueling years, drew close. Just 5 days earlier, on April 9th, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered his Confederate Army to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Union was preserved, and there was a palpable sense of relief, hope, and even jubilation in the air. The American people were eager to heal the wounds of a divided nation and look toward a future of reconciliation and unity. President Abraham Lincoln, bearing the immense burdens of wartime leadership, was no exception to this sense of cautious optimism. Despite his exhaustion, he was contemplating the immense task of rebuilding the nation, a process we now know as Reconstruction. Lincoln advocated for a lenient approach toward the defeated Southern states, promoting a policy of malice toward none and charity for all, as he had eloquently stated in his second inaugural address just weeks earlier. Seeking a brief respite from the stresses of his office, Lincoln decided to attend a play that evening at Ford's Theater, a performance of the popular British comedy Our American Cousin. The decision was somewhat spontaneous. Earlier in the day, Lincoln had invited several people to join him and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, including General Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, but they declined due to prior engagements. Eventually, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, accepted the invitation. As the presidential carriage made its way through the streets of Washington, onlookers waved and cheered. The city was adorned with flags and banners, celebrating the Union victory. When Lincoln arrived at Ford's Theater around 8:30 p.m., the performance had already begun. Upon his entrance, the orchestra struck up, "Hail to the Chief," and the audience erupted in applause. Lincoln acknowledged the crowd modestly before proceeding to the decorated presidential box on the second level, draped with American flags and a portrait of George Washington. Unbeknownst to the president and his guests, a sinister plot was unfolding. John Wilkes Booth, a 26-year-old actor and Confederate sympathizer, was preparing to carry out an act that he believed would change the course of history. Booth was a familiar face at Ford's Theater. As a member of a prominent acting family, he was well acquainted with the layout of the building and the routines of its staff. Booth had been a vocal critic of Lincoln and the Union cause. Initially, he had plotted to kidnap the president and leverage his release to negotiate the freedom of Confederate prisoners of war. However, with the Confederacy's collapse, Booth's plans turned more radical and violent. He conspired with a small group of associates, Lewis Powell, David Harold, George Atzerodt, and others, to assassinate not only President Lincoln, but also Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward. The goal was to destabilize the federal government and inspire the remnants of the Confederacy to rise again. Let's delve into the mindset of John Wilkes Booth. He was a fervent believer in the Southern cause and vehemently opposed to the abolition of slavery. Booth saw Lincoln as a tyrant who had destroyed the Constitution and the Southern way of life. In his distorted perception, assassinating Lincoln was an act of patriotism, a noble deed that would avenge the South and alter the trajectory of the nation. As the play progressed, Booth made his final preparations. He knew Our American Cousin well and planned to strike during a particular moment of uproarious laughter to mask the sound of his pistol. Around 10:15 p.m., he slipped into the theater and made his way to the presidential box. Security was minimal. Lincoln's bodyguard, Officer John Frederick Parker, had left his post. Some accounts suggest he went to a nearby tavern during intermission. Booth handed a calling card to Charles Forbes, Lincoln's valet, who allowed him entry. Once inside, Booth secured the door behind him by wedging it shut with a wooden stick, preventing anyone from entering quickly. The presidential party was engrossed in the performance, unaware of Booth's presence just feet away. Seizing the moment, Booth raised his single-shot Derringer pistol and fired at the back of Lincoln's head from point-blank range. The sound was muffled by the laughter of the audience. Major Henry Rathbone, seated nearby, sprang to his feet and grappled with Booth. Booth slashed Rathbone's arm deeply with a Bowie knife, causing a severe wound but not incapacitating him. In a dramatic turn, Booth leaped over the railing of the presidential box onto the stage below. His spur caught on a flag draped over the box, causing him to land awkwardly and fracture his left fibula just above the ankle. Rising from the stage, he brandished his knife and shouted something to the stunned audience. Witnesses' accounts vary, but many reported hearing "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants," the motto of Virginia. Some also recalled him saying, "The South is avenged." For a moment, the audience remained in shocked silence, many believing the spectacle was part of the play. It wasn't until Mary Todd Lincoln's piercing screams echoed through the theater that the horrific reality set in. Chaos erupted as people realized the president had been shot. Dr. Charles Leal, a young Army surgeon in attendance, rushed to the presidential box. Assessing Lincoln's condition, he found the president unresponsive, his breathing labored. Dr. Leal determined that moving Lincoln back to the White House would be fatal due to the severity of his wound. Instead, they carried him across the street to the Peterson House, a modest boarding house. Placing him diagonally on a bed too small for his tall frame, they began a desperate vigil through the night. Mary Todd Lincoln was inconsolable, alternating between hysteria and fainting spells. Members of Lincoln's cabinet, military officials, and close friends gathered, their faces etched with despair. Meanwhile, Booth was fleeing into the darkness of Washington streets. He met up with David Harold, and together they rode south across the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland. Despite his injury, Booth was determined to escape. They stopped at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd in the early hours of April 15th. Dr. Mudd, unaware of the assassination at that moment, treated Booth's broken leg and provided shelter. Back in Washington, the other parts of Booth's conspiracy were failing. Lewis Powell, also known as Lewis Payne, had been assigned to assassinate Secretary of State William H. Seward. Powell forced his way into Seward's home under the guise of delivering medicine. Once inside, he attacked Seward, who was bedridden from a recent carriage accident. Powell brutally stabbed Seward multiple times, as well as injuring several others who came to Seward's aid, including his son and a State Department messenger. Miraculously, Seward survived the assault, thanks in part to a metal surgical collar he was wearing, which deflected the knife from his throat. George Atzerodt, tasked with killing Vice President Andrew Johnson, lost his nerve. He checked into the Kirkwood House Hotel where Johnson was staying, but spent the evening drinking at the bar. Overcome by fear and intoxication, Atzerodt abandoned his mission entirely. As dawn approached on April 15th, President Lincoln's condition deteriorated. Despite the efforts of the attending physicians, it was clear that he would not recover. At 7:22 a.m., Abraham Lincoln breathed his last. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton reportedly uttered, "Now he belongs to the ages." The nation was plunged into profound grief and uncertainty. News of the assassination spread rapidly via telegraph, casting a somber pall over a nation that had just begun to celebrate the end of the Civil War. Public mourning was widespread. Buildings were draped in black, and citizens gathered in the streets, weeping openly. The joy of victory was overshadowed by the loss of a leader who had guided the country through its darkest hours. The manhunt for John Wilkes Booth and his accomplices became one of the largest in American history. Federal troops scoured the countryside. Booth and Harold managed to evade capture for 12 days, aided by Confederate sympathizers along their route. Their flight took them through Maryland and into Virginia, with Booth writing in his diary, expressing disbelief at being branded a criminal. On April 26th, Union soldiers cornered Booth and Harold at a tobacco barn on the Garrett family farm near Port Royal, Virginia. Harold surrendered, but Booth refused, declaring he would not be taken alive. The soldiers set fire to the barn to flush him out. In the ensuing standoff, Sergeant Boston Corbett shot Booth through a crack in the barn wall, striking him in the neck. Booth was pulled from the burning structure, paralyzed and near death. He lingered for a few hours before succumbing to his wound. His last words were reportedly, "Useless, useless." The captured conspirators were brought to trial before a military commission, a decision that sparked legal debates about the use of military tribunals for civilians. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt were found guilty and executed by hanging on July 7, 1865. Others received prison sentences. The trials were controversial, with questions raised about due process and the appropriate jurisdiction for such cases. President Lincoln's funeral procession was a monumental event. His body lay in state in the East Room of the White House and later in the Capitol Rotunda. A funeral train, dubbed the Lincoln Special, carried his remains on a 1,654-mile journey from Washington, D.C. to his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. The train retraced the route he had taken to Washington as president-elect, allowing millions of Americans to pay their respects in cities along the way. The outpouring of grief was unprecedented, reflecting the deep connection many felt with Lincoln. The impact of Lincoln's assassination was profound and far-reaching. His death left a leadership void at a critical juncture in American history. Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, but his approach to Reconstruction differed significantly from Lincoln's vision. Johnson's policies were harsher toward the South and lacked the conciliatory tone that Lincoln had advocated. This shift contributed to increased tensions during Reconstruction and hampered efforts to achieve lasting unity and equality. Lincoln's assassination also delayed progress on civil rights for newly freed African Americans. While Lincoln had begun to consider measures for black suffrage and broader civil rights, these initiatives lost momentum under Johnson's administration. It would take another century before the civil rights movement would address many of the injustices that persisted after the Civil War. Reflecting on Abraham Lincoln's legacy, we are reminded of his steadfast commitment to the principles of liberty, equality, and unity. His leadership preserved the Union and set in motion the end of slavery in the United States. Lincoln's eloquence, humility, and moral conviction continue to inspire generations. Consider his words from the Gettysburg Address,
"That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth."
These words encapsulate the ideals that Lincoln stood for and the vision he had for America, a nation united in purpose and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. As we remember the events of April 14, 1865, it's important to recognize not just the loss of a president, but the enduring influence of his ideals. The assassination was an attempt to silence a powerful voice for unity and justice, but instead, it solidified his legacy and galvanized the nation's resolve to continue the work he had begun. In today's world where divisions still exist, Lincoln's message remains relevant. His call for reconciliation, understanding, and compassion offers guidance as we navigate our own challenges. By studying history, we gain insight into the complexities of the human experience and the consequences of our actions. And thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most significant and somber days in American history. By remembering the past, we honor those who came before us and learn valuable lessons for our future. I'm Jim Hunt, and this has been the American Almanac podcast. Today's episode was April 14, 1865, Lincoln's assassination. Until next time, may we strive to build a more united and compassionate nation.